Pesticides first entered my consciousness when I was about 10 years old. And my mum took me on a wee holiday to Rotorua. We were staying in I think it was the Brent Hotel. And she befriended a woman who was clearly very, very ill. And eventually we found out that the woman believed her illness, which was probably cancer, was caused by the DDT that she used to spray for flies on the house. And you know, 10 years old, you don't remember those kind of things usually, but that has never left me, and I've never forgotten how ill that woman lived. And I think that was probably a life-changing moment for me at 10. I wasn't aware of it at the time, but it came back later. When I left school, I did a bachelor's degree in agricultural science at Massey University. And strangely enough, I don't remember being taught anything about pesticides. Fast forward to 1990s, and I was running a naturopathic clinic on Waiheke Island. Very happily running it, but I treated a number of people who kept on getting well and then getting ill again. And between us, we came to the conclusion that they were probably being exposed to pesticides, and that was making them ill. And I just could see no point in me just patching them up and getting sick again. So I thought, well, time for a change of tact. And so I sold my clinic, and then I went to work for Greenpeace as a pesticide campaigner. And then I went to work for Soil and Health Association. I ran that for a while, working on both organics and pesticides. And then in the early 1990s, I also joined Pesticide Action Network, or PAN as it's more commonly known. And I've been with PAN ever since, which is, well, you can work that out, 20-something years, quite a long time. So I gained a PhD in risk assessment of pesticides along the way. PAN's a global network of about 600 civil society organisations working to stop the abuse of pesticides, the poisoning of people and the environment, and to find safe alternatives, empowering farmers to replace pesticides with agroecology. Or as we know it in New Zealand, as organic farming or biological farming. So apart from coordinating PAN Aotearoa New Zealand, I'm the Senior Science Advisor to PAN's Asia Pacific Regional Centre based in Malaysia, and as Nora said, I often represent the whole global network at UN Chemicals Conventions meetings. I do also occasional consultancies for several of the UN agencies, the UN Environment and the Food and Agriculture Organisation. And when I'm not doing all of that, my partner who's at the back and I run a small certified organic farm on Waiheke, growing and selling fruit and veggies and eggs and honey and olive oil on the local market. I kind of feel that if I'm going to do all this work on pesticides, the only way to keep myself sane is to do the other side as well and have my hands firmly planted in the soil. So with that background, I want to talk to you tonight first about what's happening on the global scene, where there is huge concern about pesticides, much more than we hear about in this country. And then why there is that concern, what's causing it, in terms of impacts on people and the environment, and then what needs to happen next. I'll be touching on what is happening in New Zealand along the way, and we'll refer to some specific pesticides like glyphosate, better known as Roundup, chlorpyrifos, an organophosphate insecticide, and neonicotinoid insecticides. And like Nora, I have trouble with that word, neonicotinoid. I usually shorten it to neonic. But first I want to look at the context in which pesticides fit and why we find ourselves in the position we're in today. There are two main environmental problems we are facing, we as society, we as communities, and we as a planet. And that is climate change and toxic chemicals, and both of them threatening the survival of our planet and our life as we know it. And pesticides link them together. They are the only toxic chemical that is deliberately released into the environment to kill. And kill they do. They're made from petrochemicals, which along with coal is one of the major causes of climate change. So even if you don't get it about the toxic nature of pesticides, if you're concerned about climate change, that in itself is a very good reason to think very carefully about using pesticides. They prop up a system of farming that is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. On the other hand, organic and biological farming contribute to the reduction in greenhouse gases and their sequestration in the soil. So we can't look at pesticides in isolation from other environmental, social and economic issues to just identify their impacts and then ask what's a safe alternative. Because if we do that, it just leads us to replace one toxic chemical with a slightly less toxic or slightly safer chemical, without understanding the need to change the whole paradigm. We have to understand them in a global context of climate change, loss of biodiversity, poverty and disenfranchisement, to name just a few problems. But what is relevant here is that interconnection between what we do to manage pests and all of these things. And we cannot hope to find sustainable alternatives if we don't understand these connections. We need to understand pesticides also in terms of the impact on the intellectual development of our society, and whether we're undermining our ability to address all these pressing issues in the future, and of our lives in the future communities. And I'll come back to talk about this more, because for me, this is one of the key problems with pesticides, and probably many of you are completely unaware of what I'm talking about, but hopefully by the end of tonight you'll be very much more aware of it. Pesticides are embedded in the logic of Francis Bacon, an English philosopher and scientist of the 16th century, who cast the earth as a machine of disparate parts, an inert machine that the human mind can manipulate at will to achieve what we want it to achieve, and whose reach still affects us today, even though far more recent philosophers and scientists have utterly repudiated that approach. For example, John Muir, a 19th century American, who said, "The earth I tread on is not a dead inert mass, it's a body, it has a spirit, is organic and fluid to the influence of its spirit, and to whatever particle of that spirit is me." And of course that is very much more in tune with Māori philosophy and science, the concept of Māori, life principle, wairua, spirit, and the deep kinship between humans and the natural world expressed as kaitiakitanga. But the pesticide philosophy sees only the pest to kill and disregards everything else. Of course it disregards the wairua of the land, but it also disregards the impact on climate change and the effects of extractivism, which indigenous people might have been dispossessed of their land and heritage in order to extract the oil from which the pesticides are derived. We don't think of that very often. I like this Buddhist saying. In Buddhism, the most important precept of all is to live in awareness, to know what is going on, not only here, but there. For instance, when you eat a piece of bread, you may choose to be aware that our farmers in growing the wheat use chemical poisons a little too much. Eating the bread, we are somehow co-responsible for the destruction of our ecology. I started watching the recent TV series What's Next with great hope, foolishly, that finally there might be some interesting conversation about what changes we need to make to ensure the future of our planet and our communities. Day 2, agriculture, great. I thought this will be interesting. Where are we going to go with this? And what did I hear? That we keep on going the same way we're going now, just using smarter technology. In other words, applying chemicals in a little more targeted way. The same Francis Bacon approach that Earth is just there for us to manipulate and dominate like a machine and forget the rest of it. I was deeply disappointed in that. In fact, I didn't watch anymore after day 2. So please bear all of this in mind when I talk to you about the known impacts of pesticides on human health and the environment. Let's also keep in mind that just because the regulator, in our case our Environmental Protection Agency or EPA, says it's safe to use a pesticide, or more accurately, that the benefits outweigh the risks, the benefits to some outweigh the risks to everyone, that they are looking at only a tiny portion of the potential and probable impacts of a single pesticide as if it were the only thing you or the environment are exposed to. Never mind the flame retardants in your furniture, the plasticizers in your water bottle, the bisphenol A in the lining of your sweet corn tin, and never mind the stress you're under, the chronic condition you carry, or even the hand that your parents dealt you. And actually that you're not a rat or a mouse, which is what they test their chemicals on. So what's happening at a global level? Sorry about the acronyms, but I'm afraid this business is dotted with acronyms, and I'll do my best to not use too many. In 2006, over 170 countries agreed to participate in the United Nations Strategic Approach to International Chemicals Management, hereafter called SAICHM. It's a voluntary multi-stakeholder agreement that aims to achieve sound management of chemicals, initially by 2020, but that is now recognised as an impossible goal. The text of the SciChem agreement recognises, amongst other things, that highly hazardous pesticides should be replaced with safer alternatives. And this agreement is the basis of much of the international work that's going on now. Stakeholders include over 170 countries, UN agencies, NGOs like PAN, labour organisations and industry organisations. Unfortunately, New Zealand has chosen to take no part in this work at all. Never sends a delegation to the meeting, and as far as I know, takes no interest in its outcomes. So, following the adoption of SciChem in 2006, the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organisation of the United Nations, recommended a global phase-out of highly hazardous pesticides, which it then proceeded to define as pesticides that are acutely toxic, carcinogenic or cause cancer, mutagenic, meaning it damages DNA in cells, reproductive toxins, toxic to reproduction in a number of ways, or listed under three different UN chemicals conventions, or has a high incidence of severe and irreversible adverse effects on human health and the environment. Now notice what's missing from that list. No environmental effects on that list at all, nor endocrine disruption for that matter. Because of these gaps, and because FAO refused to develop an actual list of these pesticides because of industry pressure, PAN extended the criteria to include environmental effects and endocrine disruption, and then developed our own list of HHPs. And this list is now widely used by civil society organisations, countries, governments, supermarket chains, food standards like Fair Trade, who are all trying to make sure their suppliers don't use these pesticides. There are 297 on the list, on PAN's list. Of these, 100 are still registered in New Zealand. PAN went one step further and developed a list of pesticides known from official sources to be banned in one or more countries. I'm actually the keeper of that list, and I update it every 6 months or so. In the most recent edition, there are a total of 370 currently used pesticides banned by one or more countries around the world, one or more of 106 countries from whom I'm able to get an official list. Who's banned the most? Ironically, Brazil, the biggest user of pesticides in the world, has banned the most hazardous pesticides, 76, followed by Korea and Saudi Arabia, and Cambodia's banned 56. And so whereas New Zealand on this list, well down at 23rd place with 20 bans. Even China with 46 bans and India with 31 bans are doing better than us, and they are the world's largest manufacturers of these pesticides. So although I don't like to stand here and bag our country, I think it's actually really important that we're aware of where we stand in the global ratings with regard to pesticides. You would never get to hear this stuff. Nobody in New Zealand gets to know how we relate to the rest of the world with pesticides. We all think clean green New Zealand, everything's fine, government look after us, the EPA's got it sorted. When you look at what's happening on a global level, you see a really very different story, and you can see how far, sadly, we are lagging behind the rest of the world. As I said, the global aim is to phase out highly hazardous pesticides and to replace them with what? The recommendation agreed at the last International Conference on Chemicals Management of over 1,500 participants, mainly from countries, was to replace them with agroecology, essentially to replace chemicals with biology. Now this is coming from most countries in the world. They've made this commitment at an international level that that's what we need to do. We need to phase out pesticides and replace them with agroecology. This book, which is available down the back, was written specifically for that conference and was instrumental in reaching this global agreement. Sometimes in order to get a couple of lines in an agreement, you've got to spend a couple of years writing a book to provide all information, and people say, yep, we'll do that. It seems like a lot of work for a very small achievement, but sometimes that's the only way we can make progress. Agroecology, I will talk more about later. As I said already, it includes organics and biodynamics and biological farming. But briefly, it aims to work with nature, not to control it, as Francis Bacon approaches. It aims to minimise external inputs like pesticides and chemical fertilisers, But I'll come back to talk a bit more about it later. So in fact, of these lofty ideals and the agreement at an international level, really, very little is happening. Or it's not happening fast enough. But in April this year, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food delivered a report on pesticides to the UN Human Rights Council. This is the first time, I must admit, that a report on pesticides has ever gone to the UN Human Rights Council, so this was a big breakthrough for us. And she said that we need to have a global legally binding treaty to manage pesticides, including phasing out highly hazardous pesticides, replacing them with agroecology, and it must be based on a human rights approach with strict liability to producers for their damage to human health and the environment. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time now reading through her comments, some of her comments on the global situation, because it explains very well the rest of what I'm going to talk about, and explains very well, for example, why we're still using glyphosate everywhere when cancer experts have told us it's a probable human carcinogen. She said, pesticides have been aggressively promoted pesticides which have been aggressively promoted are a global human rights concern. The assertion promoted by the agrochemical industry that pesticides are necessary to achieve food security is not only inaccurate, but grossly misleading. In principle, there is enough food to feed the world. Inequitable production and distribution systems present major blockages that prevent those in need from accessing it. Studies have indicated that agroecology is capable of delivering sufficient yields to feed the entire world population and ensure that they are adequately nourished. With or without minimal use of toxic chemicals, it's possible to produce healthier, nutrient-rich food with higher yields in the longer term without polluting and exhausting environmental resources. The solution requires a holistic approach to the right to adequate food that includes phasing out dangerous pesticides and enforcing an effective regulatory framework grounded on a human rights approach. We don't have a human rights approach in New Zealand, incidentally. A colleague and I have been working with Auckland Council for some time, taking a human rights approach to problems with glyphosate use, and some people in Auckland who are severely sensitive to it. Auckland Council just is not interested in a human rights approach. Why would you be interested in human rights? To continue, the pesticide industry is dominated by a few transnational corporations that wield extraordinary power over global agrochemical research, legislative initiatives, and regulatory agendas. Regulatory authorities may be under strong pressure from industry to prevent or reverse bans on hazardous pesticides. The pesticide industry's efforts to influence policymakers and regulators have obstructed reforms and paralysed pesticide restrictions globally. Despite their widespread use, chemical pesticides have not achieved reduction in crop losses in the last 40 years. This has been attributed to their indiscriminate and non-selective use, killing not only pests, but also their natural enemies and insect pollinators. Success must be calculated in terms other than economic profitability and take into consideration the costs of pesticides on human health, the economy and the environment. Political will is needed to re-evaluate and challenge the vested interests, incentives and power relations that keep industrial agrochemical dependent farming in place. So those were her words, not mine, but I cheer her for them. Right now, as we near 2020 and the goal of sound management of chemicals is not met, there are discussions, global discussions taking place. How to better manage pesticides included. And part of this discussion is whether or not we should have a legally binding global agreement. PAN, of course, is throwing its weight behind that proposal. But it will be a long and difficult process, so don't hold your breath hoping we'll get one anytime soon. I don't know if the New Zealand government is even aware of this proposal. And they will almost certainly oppose it, so I'm in no hurry to tell them. Now I want to turn to why pesticides are such a huge global poison. And one reason is acute poisoning. There are so many symptoms, it's very hard to be selective on this. So what I've done is I've just written down a few of them. We start with a sore throat and we end with death, and in between it's just about everything you can think of is a described symptom of pesticide poisoning. But note how many of those symptoms look like a case of the flu or a cold or a hangover or I ate something wrong or whatever else excuses get used to disguise the fact that somebody might have pesticide poisoning, and this happens unbelievably often. Most medical practitioners are not trained in pesticide poisoning symptoms. They don't know. When someone comes to see them with some of those symptoms, they will think flu, wrong food, whatever. And as a result, people go untreated, and the level of poisoning goes unrecorded. There are no accurate global figures on the level of pesticide poisoning, but they range from 1 to 41 million people per year. In fact, I've seen a figure of 100,000 people per year being poisoned, with an estimated 200,000 deaths from accidental deaths, mostly occupational, and 300,000 suicides by pesticide. Using pesticide for suicide is one of the most common suicide means in a number of countries. So I can see the looks on your faces. I think of countries like Sri Lanka, where it was number one until their proactive government took charge of the situation and they banned the pesticides that were causing the most problem. And there was a plummeting in the rate of suicides in that country. It was really effective. And actually, interestingly, their agricultural productivity didn't decline at all, just the suicide rate. But these figures are very rough. There's estimated to be at least 50 to 80% underreporting because in many countries people don't have the wherewithal to go to a doctor to report it. They can't afford it. There aren't any doctors. Or doctors don't recognise the symptoms when they are reported. Some studies I have read give rates of poisoning in farmers and farm workers as anything from 4% to 100%. The 100% was a study of women in Pakistan who were picking cotton 15 days after it had been sprayed. And 100% of those women were getting poisoned 15 days after the spraying. So my current project with PAN is trying to bring together all the information I can access on poisonings globally into a publication so we can get a better understanding of just how big the problem is globally. We do know that it's costing us a huge amount of money, or costing the world a huge amount of money. One UN report found that the accumulated costs of acute poisoning alone in sub-Saharan Africa was $97 billion US dollars by 2020. And I think you're probably aware how poor sub-Saharan Africa is. So to lose $97 billion doesn't bear thinking about. And in probably a more conceivable figure, in Brazil, for every $1 spent on pesticides, the cost of acute poisoning alone is $1.28. I mean, what can you say? Why do we use these things? In New Zealand, we have very little information about what's going on, but there was a study published in 2010 that identified that exposure to pesticides and fertilisers is the third-ranked airborne agent of work-related disease in New Zealand, and responsible for 76 fatalities per year. Now, I didn't know that, and I think many of us would be really shocked to know that we've got 76 people dying every year from pesticides in this country. We tend to associate such figures with overseas countries where the regulation's not as good as ours apparently is. This represents approximately 11% of the burden of work-related disease, so it's quite a significant problem. But these figures do not include the number of people who get chronically ill from pesticides. And globally, there is no clue how much that might be. There is no way of knowing. And no one has a system of reporting such problems. Most medical practitioners, as I've said, are unable to diagnose a condition as having been caused by pesticides, especially when it's acute and a chronic condition. So here are some of the chronic health effects that we know from studies can be caused by or intensified by exposure to pesticides. In terms of cancer, let me just read you the list of cancers. Multiple myeloma, soft tissue sarcoma, Ewing sarcoma, lymphoma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, leukemia, melanoma, neuroblastoma, Wills tumour, germ cell tumours, retinoblastoma, which is an eye tumour, cancers of the esophagus, stomach, prostate, testes, breast, ovary, cervix, bladder, thyroid, lung, brain, kidney, pancreas, liver, colon and rectum. Is there anything left? I don't think there is. You know, so, and there's a lot of work being done showing the cancer problem. Neurodevelopmental effects in children include epilepsy, cerebral palsy, autism, reduced IQ and delayed development. Other neurobehavioural problems include personality change, impulsive suicidal intent, impaired concentration, psychiatric disorders, long-term cognitive impairment, memory and language disorders, heightened sense of smell, deterioration of handwriting, impaired tolerance of exercise, and neuromuscular problems. And then there's the rest of that list there. And there are probably more. That's just what we're aware of. Disruption of the endocrine system lies at the heart of many of these effects. And here is where we run into problems with our regulators, because endocrine disrupting chemicals don't act like other ones. Our hormonal system is designed to react to hormones at very low concentrations, parts per billion or parts per trillion, and not at higher levels. Many chemicals, most chemicals in fact, follow the principle that the higher the dose you're exposed to, the worse the toxic effect. It's very logic, and we're all aware of that kind of thinking. But endocrine disrupting chemicals don't do that. Many of them are most toxic at lower doses or at middle doses, and at a higher dose you don't get to see an impact. But our regulatory system is based on only testing chemicals at higher doses. And if it doesn't cause an adverse effect at a higher dose, then it's assumed to be safe at a lower dose. And this is a problem we have with many, it's why we have so many endocrine disrupting chemicals still registered. The situation gets even worse when you consider the problem of mixtures. We're not exposed to one chemical at a time. We're not even exposed to just one pesticide at a time. A few years back I did an analysis of the number of pesticides in the average Kiwi dinner at night. It's 17. So you can be eating if you're not eating organic food and you sit down to your dinner at night, you could be eating 17 different pesticides in your dinner at low levels, but maybe low enough levels to cause endocrine disruption. And who knows what the toxic effect of that mixture of chemicals is, because it's very seldom studied. When it has been studied, what has been often found is that one chemical will make another one very much more toxic. An example of this is a chemical called POEA. I'm not going to give you its full-length title because it's too much. It's what's called as a surfactant, and it's added to many formulations of glyphosate to help make the herbicide penetrate the cells better. That's what surfactants do. They break down the cell membrane and the chemical goes into the cell. That makes it more toxic and the plant dies more quickly. Great, if that's what you want. The trouble is it does the same to our cells as well, and animal cells. So any pesticide formulation that contains the POEA in it will be more toxic to you than the active ingredient, which is tested by the regulator and passed as of acceptable risk. I'm going to come back to this more when I talk about glyphosate at length later on. I just wanted to bring it in to make you, to draw focus on the necessity to understand about mixtures. So in summary, our regulatory system looks at a single chemical at a time, focusing on the impacts at high doses, not even acknowledging endocrine disruption, and basing their outcomes on what is safe or acceptable, actually, not causing unacceptable harm to the average 70 kilogram man. So when they say it is safe to be exposed to a pesticide, be very aware that in fact they actually don't know the full potential impact of real everyday exposure. And as I've said, that could be 17 pesticides in your dinner. I want to talk now about children. The insecticide called Pyrifos, Donald Trump. Children are very much more sensitive to the impacts of pesticides than our children, and they can be extremely vulnerable to them during critical windows of development. And that's where they are, some of them, for endocrine disruptors. But children are now born pre-polluted with toxins that have lifelong impacts. At least 41 different pesticides have been found in maternal cord blood. So the unborn fetus is being bathed in a cocktail of pesticides, including glyphosate. The unborn fetus and the newborn child are at the greatest risk from pesticides, and interference with their development processes can lead to lifelong alterations in growth, development, behaviour, and disease occurrence. The nervous system is particularly vulnerable, and exposure to even very tiny, tiny amounts of neurotoxins during critical days of fetal development can change the architecture of the brain forever. Such exposure can result in lowered IQ, learning disabilities, ADHD, and autism, to the extent that American scientists now recognise what they call a silent pandemic of developmental neurotoxicity. They attribute this to a number of environmental toxins like lead and also organophosphate insecticides. This slide was taken from a study carried out in Mexico in 1998, and it shows two series of drawings. The Yaqui Indians used to live together. They were a very genetically homogeneous group of people who lived together in the valley for many generations. In the 1940s, modern chemical agriculture was introduced, and some of the people embraced the change to modern agriculture and started had massive use of pesticides. Some of their community didn't like this idea, and they left there and they went up and lived in the foothills, and they did not use any pesticides at all. The only thing they were exposed to was the government DDT spraying once a year for malaria. Meanwhile, the people in the valley were using up to 90 applications of pesticides per year. And these sets of drawings of children the same age being asked to draw the same thing, and you can see the difference between the children that were exposed to pesticides and the children that weren't. I want to illustrate this problem further with the insecticide chlorpyrifos, organophosphate, sold here under trade names like Lawsban and Suspon Dream and Exterminate and many more. In fact, there are 17 products registered in New Zealand. It's used worldwide, very popular insecticide, banned only in Palestine, Saudi Arabia and Sri Lanka. In this terms, the most progressive countries in the world. So there you are. As an aside, I made a submission. This is the last submission I made to our EPA when they reassessed it a few years ago. I made a 76-page submission on chlorpyrifos, pointing out a lot of the studies that I'm going to come to shortly, and giving safer alternatives for every single known use of chlorpyrifos in New Zealand. Alternatives that are already in use by New Zealand farmers. And the response from the EPA was, oh, but farmers need to use it. And so they kept it registered. Chlorpyrifos was actually is almost completely banned in the UK because somebody tipped a bit down their drain and it killed all the aquatic life along a 30-kilometre stretch of the Kennett Avon Canal. They just tipped a bit down their drain and it killed 30 kilometres of the canal. It's toxic. Anyway, back to children. There was a series of studies carried out in the US on chlorpyrifos and its impact on children. Prenatal exposure, as measured by elevated levels of metabolites in a woman's urine during pregnancy, resulted in decreased cognitive development, particularly perceptual reasoning, working memory, processing speed, and verbal comprehension, and an altered brain structure. It gave rise to pervasive developmental disorders, including autism. As little as 4.6 picograms per gram of cord blood resulted in a drop of 1.4% of a child's IQ and 2.8% of its working memory. 1 picogram is 1 trillionth of a gram, so 4.6 trillionths of a gram. I mean, can you imagine that, how small it is? That was all it took to cause these profound changes in children. And you compare that with the level of 0.1 gram of chlorpyrifos that we get in our food, fresh produce in New Zealand. Of course, not all of that 0.1 gram of chlorpyrifos is absorbed, but I'm pretty sure that out of 0.1 gram you could get 1 trillionth passing through to cord blood. So where does Donald Trump fit into all this? How do we get to blame him for this? The US Environmental Protection Agency has gone through a very long, in-depth assessment of chlorpyrifos over many years, in part, and in fact largely because of the studies that I've mentioned. Last year they decided to ban it completely, and they announced that the ban would be in March this year. And then of course there was the election. And then there was that inauguration that we all heard about as well. Dow Chemical, who's the main manufacturer of chlorpyrifos, donated $1 million to the inauguration. Trump then appointed Dow's CEO, Andrew Liveris, to head the White House Manufacturing Working Group. And on March the 9th this year, Scott Pruitt, the climate change denier who heads the US EPA, had a private half-hour meeting in a Houston hotel with Dow's Andrew Liveris, and 20 days later he announced chlorpyrifos wasn't going to be banned after all. What a surprise. Interestingly though, 7 states have joined PAN and a number of other NGOs in taking legal challenges against this decision. There's New York, California, Maine, Maryland, Washington, Vermont and Massachusetts. So we await with interest to see what happens with that legal challenge. But as I said, well, lucky us, we don't have Donald Trump or Scott Pruitt, but what we've got instead was what I told you, that we had an EPA doing the assessment, and I heard later from some EPA scientists that they had actually recommended that chlorpyrifos be banned in New Zealand as well. But the EPA said, no, the farmers need to use it. So we had a decision made on politics, not on science. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the US. So whilst we look in horror at what's happening in the US, let's also be aware that similar politically based decisions get made on what should have been theoretically a scientific process in this country. So our EPA did say you can't buy it off the shelf and use it in your own home, so you can't poison your kids any longer. That was a decision actually the US EPA made more than a decade ago. But we are still allowed to hire someone to spray chlorpyrifos in our backyard so that we can get someone else to poison our kids if we want to. I'm going to take a small break now and give you a small break from me and give you a little video to watch which recaps a little bit of what I've said. So just bear with me for a moment while I find my way into this process.
It's true, not all chemicals are bad, but toxic metals like lead and mercury are found in all of us. So are persistent toxins like PCBs and endocrine disruptors such as bisphenol A and flame retardants. We've been studying the impact of toxins on children for the past 30 years and reached the inescapable conclusion: little things matter. Toxins can have a lifelong impact on children. We've also discovered that extremely low levels of toxins can impact brain development. Let's take a look at the percent of children who are exposed to some of these toxins using a national study in the United States. To keep it simple, we'll use 100 children to represent all children. Mercury is found in 89% of children, primarily from eating large fish contaminated by pollution. Lead is detected in the blood of all children, regardless of race, income, or where they live. Over 80% of children are exposed to organophosphate pesticides, mostly from food. All children are exposed to PCBs, a persistent pollutant that was banned in the 70s, but will linger for generations. Bisphenol A, or BPA, is found in 96% of children. PBDEs, a type of flame retardant, are found in 100% of children. But these toxins don't occur in isolation. Children are exposed to many toxins and dozens of untested chemicals all the time. Let's take a look at the body burden of a typical child, one toxin at a time. If each marble represents 1 part per billion of a toxin, this figure represents the body burden of a typical child. 1 part per billion is deceptively small. It is only about 2 tablespoons of sugar in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. But chemicals can be biologically active, even at very low levels. The chemical industry has tried to assure us that concentrations of these toxins are too small to cause harm. But chemicals designed by drug companies to alter behavior, like the prescribed dose of Ritalin, a drug commonly used to treat children with ADHD, is active at levels about the same or even lower than toxins found in the blood. Besides, a lot of studies have shown that some chemicals can be toxic, even at very low levels. As the body burden of PBDEs in pregnant women increases, the intellectual ability of their children decreases. Let's take a closer look. As the level of PBDEs in mother's blood increases from 10 to 100 parts per billion, the IQ scores of their children drop by about 5 points. We see a similar pattern with organophosphate pesticides. As the level of organophosphate pesticides in pregnant women increases from 10 to 75 parts per billion, the IQ scores of their children drop by about 5 points. In the 1960s, hundreds of children died from severe lead poisoning every summer. Since then, much lower levels of exposure have been shown to result in learning deficits and brain disorders like ADHD. In fact, the World Health Organization and other agencies agree there is no safe level of lead exposure. As the level of lead in children's blood increases from 0 to 100 parts per billion, IQ scores drop by about 6 points. In contrast, an increase from 100 to 200 parts per billion results in an IQ drop of 2 more points. An increase from 200 to 300 parts per billion results in an IQ drop of another point. The impact of toxins on the developing brain is permanent. Children who are more heavily exposed to toxins won't reach the same peak cognitive ability as those who have lower exposures. These studies show that there is no safe level of exposure. They also indicate that the way we regulate toxins, which assumes there is a safe level, fails to protect children. The chemical industry argues that the effect of toxins on children is subtle and of little consequence. But that's misleading. Little shifts in children's IQ scores have a big impact on the number of children who are challenged or gifted. Let's go back to our original sample of 100 children and look at a typical distribution of IQ scores. Most of us have IQ scores that fall between 85 and 115 points. Only 2.5% of children have an IQ above 130, which is considered gifted. There are about 6 million children in this group. On the other end of the distribution, another 2.5% of children have an IQ below 70, which is considered challenged. The impact of exposure to a toxin like lead causes a 5-point drop in IQ. This shift results in a 57% increase in the number of children that are challenged, from 6 million to 9.4 million. There is a corresponding decrease in the number of children that are gifted, from 6 million to 2.4 million. Little shifts matter. The impact of exposure to another toxin, like flame retardants, results in a further increase in the number of children who are challenged, from 9.4 million to over 11 million. There is a further decrease in the number of gifted children. Although many, or even most, chemicals are harmless, the cumulative impact of exposures to 3 or 4 toxins is overwhelming to imagine. In Canada and the United States, chemicals are used in consumer products and released into the environment before they are tested for toxic effects. By allowing children to be exposed to toxins or chemicals of unknown toxicity, we are unwittingly using our children as part of a massive experiment. But it doesn't have to be this way. Like the European Union, we could require industry to prove that the chemicals they use aren't toxic before they enter the market. How can we avoid exposures to toxins or chemicals of unknown toxicity? The ultimate solution is to revise how we regulate chemicals. Consider writing a letter to your government representative and urge them to require industry to test their products before they are put on the market. There are a few simple ways you can reduce your child's exposure to toxins. Eat fresh or frozen foods. If possible, choose organic. Try to avoid canned foods and steer clear of heavily processed foods. If you are pregnant or planning to become pregnant, eat fish low in mercury. Don't use pesticides in and around your home. Check your home for lead hazards, especially if it was built before 1960. Frequent cleaning of floors and surfaces can help reduce children's exposures to lead, flame retardants, and other toxins in house dust.
So, a little more with pesticides than that, but it reinforces what I said at the beginning, that we're not exposed to pesticides all by themselves. I want to move on now to talk about glyphosate, and particularly glyphosate in cancer. There's a very dirty game being played out there about glyphosate, and I'm going to try and summarise the main points. It's long and a bit complicated, but I think it's important that people understand what's going on. In 1985, using Monsanto studies on rats and mice, the US EPA declared glyphosate a Group C possible carcinogen based on renal tumours in mice. Monsanto fought back, and an independent review led to the US classification being changed to Group D, not classifiable as to human carcinogenicity, on the basis of, quote, a lack of statistical significance and uncertainty. Monsanto was still not happy, and in 1991 the US EPA, on their behalf, declared glyphosate as Group E, evidence of non-carcinogenicity in humans, on the basis of 3 studies on rats and mice, all of which showed a variety of carcinogenic effects, but which they considered to be not caused by the glyphosate. Thyroid and pancreatic carcinomas, testicular tumours, liver adenomas. Earlier than that, even in 1986, Dow, a chemical company who used to own the molecule called glyphosate before Monsanto did, had already found increased incidence of hepatocellular carcinoma, leukemia and lymphoma in mice. I've been drawing attention of our government and our councils in New Zealand to these studies since 1990, but have gotten nowhere, actually, because nobody's interested, because the US EPA said, no, it's quite safe, don't worry about it. It was a lot of other reasons. Mice got liver cancer was just coincidence, it didn't really matter. In 2015, the International Agency on Research in Cancer, it's an arm of the World Health Organization, using those same studies, plus a number of other studies, all of which were independent, peer-reviewed, published studies and not secret industry studies, classified glyphosate as a Group 2 probable human carcinogen because of limited evidence in humans of carcinogenicity, particularly non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, sufficient evidence in experimental animals for carcinogenicity, and that included those studies I've already referred to, and strong evidence that glyphosate and glyphosate-based formulations are genotoxic and can induce oxidative stress, both mechanisms that can lead to cancer. This IARC ruling, IARC being an International Agency for Research on Cancer, the IARC ruling resulted in massive public, medical and scientific concern, especially about spraying of crops before harvest to burn them down, which means basically killing off the crop before you harvest it, and this is widespread in New Zealand. It makes it easier to harvest, and in some cases, for example, with sugar, it actually increases the level of sugar in the final product, but it also, of course, increases the glyphosate residue as well. So there's been a lot of concern about this particular practice of burning down crops pre-harvest with glyphosate because of the levels that have been left behind. And also its use in public places because so many people are being exposed to glyphosate. Monsanto went into total meltdown, as did farmers everywhere, and there's just been huge political pressure all around the world piled onto regulators to not acknowledge that glyphosate is a carcinogen. In 2016 and 17, attention focused on the European Union, and that's because their registration of glyphosate expires at the end of this year, and so they have a registration period for 15 years, and at the end of 15 years it has to be reapproved for, reassessed for approval, and if it's not reapproved then it's off the market. But there was an uproar in Europe. The European Parliament wanted it totally banned, but they have a law in Europe if a chemical is shown to be carcinogenic, or if a pesticide is shown to be carcinogenic, it cannot be used. One of the few countries in the world that actually have that law. It's not the same in New Zealand. We're allowed to use carcinogenic pesticides, just so long as the risk is acceptable. In other words, that the benefits outweigh the risk. But in Europe, they don't take that approach. They say if it's carcinogen, it's gone. You can't have it, which is great. So their European Food Safety Authority, using industry studies, disagreed with IARC. Their review was based on a German dossier, which was drafted by the Glyphosate Industry Task Force. Not surprisingly, it found it wasn't carcinogenic. However, the EU did ban formulations that contain the surfactant POEA, which I talked about earlier, that makes glyphosate more toxic than if it's glyphosate by itself. They extended the approval for only 18 months while they carried out more studies. And they advised that countries should minimise pre-harvest use of glyphosate to burn down crops and minimise use in public places. Italy went one stage further, bless its cotton socks, and banned pre-harvest use of glyphosate completely, and banned its use in public place, and banned its use in places frequented by children and the elderly. Apart from 1 or 2 countries like Sri Lanka that have banned glyphosate completely, Italy is up there as probably the best regulations on it at the moment. The EU is now proposing, as of the last couple of weeks, to extend the proposal for the reapproval for 10 years. That decision has not yet been made, but it's not far off. But on the other hand, there is now a petition in front of 1 million people calling for its complete ban. So we have to wait and see what the political outcome is of that. In New Zealand has not carried out a proper reassessment of glyphosate, despite it being requested to. It did ask one toxicologist to have a look at the IARC classification and what the European Food Safety Authority has said. He took a very narrow view. He looked only at the active ingredient and not at the full formulations. And he failed to look at what modern science now regards as important mechanisms of carcinogenesis, oxidative stress, inflammation, and endocrine disruption. And naturally, he decided, our EPA decided it's not carcinogenic. When Green MP Stephen Browning asked the government to release the names of the glyphosate formulations that contained POEA, so we at least knew what they were, they wouldn't, because it's regarded as commercially sensitive information. He was able to find out that there are 62 glyphosate-based herbicides with POEA on our market. That's 72% of registered glyphosate products, and we could identify from the list that Italy provided of the products with the POEA that at least we know Roundup, Rodeo and Touchdown have all got POEA in them and should not be being used at all in this country. And just in case you think that New Zealand's out of the reach of Monsanto, when I was one of the consultants to Auckland City Council in the mid-1990s to develop its weed management policy, this was predating Auckland Council, I was handed by a staff member a paper to include in the assessment. The paper had no author, and no date on it, and no real title on it, but I recognised it immediately as a paper coming from Monsanto, because I'd seen it before. So why is Monsanto handing Auckland Council staff its studies without a date, without an author, without a title, and expecting Auckland City Council to take them on board? I have to wonder how much that's still happening. Actually, the Auckland Council and the Auckland City Council banned the use of glyphosate on roadsides in 1997. And we had 14 years of glyphosate-free roadside weed management, non-toxic, using palm oil, pine oil, coconut oil, hot water, steam, those methods. Very successfully for 14 years. And then we got Auckland, the government decided that Auckland City and all the other cities would amalgamate, and we've got Auckland Council and Auckland Transport. Ever since then, the community has been fighting back to try to stop the non-chemical areas being sprayed with chemicals now. And it's a long fight that's still going on. But both organisations, both Auckland Transport and Auckland Council, are absolutely determined. Some members of some of the staff are absolutely determined that glyphosate will be being used everywhere. It's hard to get to the reason why. In the US EPA has also reassessed glyphosate for its carcinogenicity, and they also looked only at industry studies. They didn't look at any of the majority of the peer-reviewed independent scientific literature, which is what IARC used. When IARC did its study and said it was carcinogenic, it used independent peer-reviewed published literature and not secret industry studies. And this is the difference between a group of independent scientists looking at properly published studies and a group of regulators looking at industry studies. The first says it's carcinogenic and the second says it's not. Despite the US EPA coming up with that this decision, and despite an illegal appeal by Monsanto, California has just labelled glyphosate as a carcinogen and reduced the safe level exposure to 100 times below that allowed by the US EPA. Presumably that's probably around about 100 times lower than our so-called safe level as well. And more than 800 cancer patients are busy suing Monsanto at the moment. These dirty tricks have started up once again. Just a few weeks ago, a industry-linked Reuters journalist. We always tend to think of Reuters as a pretty, a pretty good news source. Reuters journalist Kate Kelland claims that the chair of the IR cancer assessment didn't address one paper that showed that glyphosate doesn't cause, or showed no link between glyphosate and lymphoma. And she also referred to a paper by a scientist called Tyrone, which was criticising the IARC evaluation. But IARC have responded. Now, IARC is a very esteemed body of scientists. Scientists don't go public. They don't do media. They don't do political discussions. But ever since this war has erupted between Monsanto and IARC, IARC has been forced to go public to defend itself. And this latest public defence was just literally about a week ago, I think, when they pointed out that the Tyrone study she'd been referring to was actually paid for by Monsanto. And so it goes on. In 2017 also, earlier this year, the documents that are starting to be uncovered as these court cases against Monsanto are evolving, has discovered there's been a certain amount of collusion between Monsanto and EPA, the US EPA. And that one of the US EPA staffers, chair of their Environmental Protection Agency's Cancer Assessment Review Committee, colluded with Monsanto to try to shut down the assessment. They also have suggested that Monsanto has been ghostwriting research has been attributed to academics. This isn't the first example of collusion between Monsanto and the US EPA. There was a recent analysis by, I think it was a Canadian scientist, of original data submitted by Monsanto in the 1980s to the US EPA regarding the toxicity of glyphosate to aquatic insects. And it found that the US EPA had manipulated the conclusions, which resulted in glyphosate being described as non-toxic. And it has been described as non-toxic ever since. So we had one instance back in the 1980s where a US EPA person manipulated the conclusions, concluded it was non-toxic when the data didn't show that at all, and it's been called non-toxic or safe ever since, and still is there. This is why I took some time to read to you about the US Special Rapporteur's conclusions about the impact of the pesticide industry on regulation worldwide and in countries. And I have to say we need to look to our own country to consider whether we've got those kind of influences going on as well. Meanwhile, the fight does continue, and Dr. Chris Portier, a retired US government scientist, he's just analysed previously confidential data that's been released under this court process, and he's found that 8 significant increases in tumour incidence did not appear in any of the European or the US assessments of cancer, of glyphosate for cancer. So that's the story to date. Most of it doesn't get told in New Zealand media, but it's unfolding on almost a daily basis. Next week there will be another story, there will be another dirty trick from Monsanto, there will be another slander case, there will be another decision from somebody. Many local authorities around the world have banned glyphosate for use in public places. Some places have banned all use in home gardens as well. Places right throughout Europe, UK, US, Australia even. New Zealand, Christchurch, I think, is the only one. From where it's Stephanie, Christchurch. It's depressing. Sorry. But we have a community that fights back, and we have a community that keeps on fighting. And as I said, in Auckland, we have been fighting since 1994. We won for 14 years. We continue to fight, and the community will continue to fight, but it's difficult. It's demoralising at times, and it's exhausting, and we need a lot of people to help. You can't leave it to 1 or 2 people to do this job. We need communities, we need organisations like NTAG to be part of this fight. And I thank NTAG for that. I don't want to leave glyphosate just at this point with only talking about cancer, because it's not only one of many health impacts of glyphosate. Kidney damage is another one, but it also has also breast cancer. I just want to refer to breast cancer very briefly here. I wrote a book on pesticides and breast cancer back in 2007. I was asked to write a pamphlet on pesticides and breast cancer, and I looked at it and I thought, well, how can I tell which pesticides don't cause breast cancer? If I write and say, well, here's 4 or 5 that cause breast cancer, that exonerates all the rest of them. So I spent 3 years in researching thousands of published studies and eventually wrote a book that's down the back there, identifying 99 pesticides that are probably increasing breast cancer around the world. I didn't include glyphosate in it because at that stage I didn't know that it did. But since then there have been studies published showing that it causes an increase in the growth of breast cancer cells. So glyphosate becomes pesticide number 100 on the breast cancer list. But glyphosate also has quite profound effects in the environment. And there are quite obvious effects, as toxicity to fish, but the ones that concern me most are the much more subtle effects that are not taken into account in registration processes. They don't make headlines, and nobody really thinks about them. And it's these subtle effects, particularly on the aquatic environments, that most concern me. They're some of the most important aspects of pesticides, because they're silently destabilising the environment and leading to ecosystem instability. Glyphosate causes significant impacts on species that underpin the entire marine or aquatic food chain. They can have profound impacts on microorganisms, plankton, algae and amphibia at low concentrations, potentially tipping the ecological balance and resulting in algal blooms. In NIWA, as Nora said in the introduction, NIWA found glyphosate in its metabolite right throughout the sediment in Auckland Harbour. And they concluded that it probably came from roadside spraying, and at that point they labelled it as a chemical of concern to the marine environment. And that was in 2008. We keep on using it on our roadsides ever since, because I doubt that many other parts of the country are actually even aware of that finding by NIWA or of the fact that it's been labelled as a chemical of concern. It's an issue that Whangarei District Council and Regional Council should really be looking into, because I imagine that a lot of the roadside use in the city here would end up out there in the marine environment. I haven't talked much about the environmental impacts of pesticides at all, and it will be a shorter series, a shorter section this part. The subtle effects that occur in the marine environment from glyphosate are echoed in terrestrial environments by a number of pesticides, particularly wiping out beneficial insects that contribute so much to natural pest management. We humans seem to have developed this aversion to insects. In fact, of over 1 million insect species, only 1 to 3% of them are pests, and the rest of them get wiped out as collateral damage in our indiscriminate warfare. Bees, of course, are the most well-known victims of insecticides. These days, with the neonicotinoid insecticides being credited with massive losses of colonies, particularly in Europe and North America. There are these, I mean, you don't have to remember these words, but I'm going to refer to them, so I'm putting them up in writing so you can see them. And I'm going to call them neonics because it's a lot easier to say than neonicotinoid. Imidacloprid, clothianidin and trimethoxam are the most commonly used ones for seed coatings, which is one of the main uses for imidacloprid, for neonics. The seeds are coated, planted in the ground. As the plant grows, the insecticide is taken up into the plant and it spreads right throughout the plant. So every single part of the plant becomes toxic. The nectar, the pollen, the fruit that you eat, or the vegetables you eat, but in case of corn, it's the corn kernels. Also these little things on the right-hand side. That's what's called a guttation droplet, and it's the little droplets of water that are expressed by plants in the early hours of the morning when the vapour pressure drops. And those little drops of water are full of neonicotinoid insecticides, and the bees drink those. So our regulators say, don't worry about the neonics in bees in this country. We don't use them on. We don't allow them to be used on crops that bees go to for pollen. This is corn. This is where the things are being expressed. This is where we mostly use, and bees drink this water. Bees fly at least 3 kilometres from the hive. there wouldn't be many places in New Zealand where there is corn grown and there aren't bees within 3 kilometres. So it's a bit of a rubbish decision by our regulator, I have to say. There are a wealth of, and also the other thing I want to add about this is that in New Zealand, we know that the neonic insecticides, its widespread use on seeds. What we don't know is exactly which seeds, apart from maize, grass and a few other crops, because there's no requirement in this country to label treated seeds. So farmers, gardeners, anybody, when they're buying seeds, unless you buy organic seeds, you can't be sure you're not going to get a treated seed. You can tell a seed is treated. It's going to look something like that with some garish colour on it, usually. But you're not going to know what that treatment is. It could be a fungicide, it probably is a fungicide. It could be insecticide, it could be a neonic. You won't know. I've tried, Stefan's tried, and numbers have tried to get the government to require labelling of treated seeds. Nothing's changed. So these seeds are being used, and your only way of knowing that you're not using them is to buy organic seeds or to ask for, ensure that they're untreated seeds. And I would urge you all to do that for the sake of the bees and your own health. There are a wealth of studies linking neonics to decline in declines in lifespan, changes in behaviour, ability to navigate, survivability. These studies are often criticised by industry people as being not field realistic. They're done in the study that doesn't relate to what happens in the field. But just last Friday, Canadian scientists released a study that they'd done that was field realistic. And they carried it out in field conditions for maize in Canada. And they found that colonies near maize, exposed to up to 4 months, which is what would be the normal growing season there for corn, they found increased worker bee mortality, loss of queens late in the season, too late to recruit new queens, meaning that the hive would go into winter with no queen and would therefore perish. And a reduction in hygiene behaviour in the hive, a reduction in grooming. Grooming is incredibly important in New Zealand for controlling the varroa mite. Bees that have a high level of grooming behaviour don't suffer from varroa mite. Varroa mite's what knocks off most of the beehives in New Zealand. So if you add into this a bit of neonicotinoid poisoning to the bees, you can just see that we're magnifying a problem that we already have with varroa. There was another study published on the same day, on Friday actually, carried out in 3 countries in Europe, England, Germany and Hungary. And this was quite a fascinating study because it was funded by Bayer and Syngenta, the 2 chemical companies that manufacture the neonics. And they've funded a few studies before, and of course they've always found that they don't affect the bees, so the bees are completely unaffected. This study found that it does affect the bees, so this is the first time an industry-backed study has shown that the neonicotinoids are affecting the bee. They found 24% reduction in colony size and a reduction in the production in bumblebees as well, and concluded that it was reducing the capacity of bee species to establish populations the following year. But here's the best bit. In their trial, they used only 2 of the 3 that I mentioned before, clothianidin and thiamethoxam. And when they analysed the nests of the bumblebees, they found those 2 pesticides, and they also found the imidacloprid. And there has been a moratorium on the use of those 3 in the European Union for a few years now. So the imidacloprid that was ending up in the bumblebees' nest had been persisting in the environment for quite some time. And persistence is becoming a bit of a problem in New Zealand too. There was a study carried out by the Auckland University of Technology earlier this year. They sampled cornfields in Waikato, East Cape and Bay of Plenty. And 48 out of 50 samples, they found clothianidin and imidacloprid in the soils. Those are the levels they found. Imidacloprid, these were the highest levels, 9.4 nanogram, and clothianidin, 26.7 nanogram. 8 of the 9 sites had levels of imidacloprid 14 times higher than the maximum allowable level for it in this country. And the only reason I haven't got the same figure for clothianidin is because there is no maximum allowable level, even though it's just as toxic as imidacloprid. Now, this sampling was done 1 year after the seeds were sown, just before the next lot of seeds were going to be sown, meaning that the plants were going into their next season with that level in the soil already. plus the level that's just about to be added with the new seed. So you can see the problem we have in New Zealand is that, as everywhere else in the world, is the levels are building up and up and up in the soil because they're persistent, and also because only about I can't remember the figure. I've got it on the next slide, I believe. Yeah, 98% of imidacloprid is not taken up by the plant. It stays in the soil, it persists in there, and adds to next year's supply, and next year's, and next year's, and next year's. There's a major problem with imidacloprid also being contaminating water supplies because, as I said, it is persistent, and it becomes so bizarre in Netherlands that the level of imidacloprid in their stream, 25,000 times the legal limit. They can take water out of that stream and straight onto plants as an insecticide without adding anything to it. The level of the water in that stream is an insecticide. And that's what we face in this country if we keep on with the kind of use that we've got at the moment. I've only got time to talk about the environmental contamination of one group of insecticides, but I just do need to add that every environmental media in every corner of the earth is contaminated with pesticides. From the Arctic and the Antarctic to the top of the Himalayas and the top of our southern Alps, that's called pyrifos, to marine sediment, snow, ice, rain, fog, air, drains, creeks, streams, rivers, lakes, and the sea, all are contaminated with pesticides. I briefly wanted to mention rain. Glyphosate. Rainfall in the US has been found to be quite heavily laced with glyphosate. One of the things that happens is glyphosate is quite persistent in the soil. And when the soil dries and the wind comes and picks up the dust particles and they go up into the air, and they come down again in the rain. Now, we've probably got the same situation happening in New Zealand. We just don't know about it. And any of us who are drinking rainwater collected off our roofs, we're probably drinking, sorry to say, we're probably drinking glyphosate and a few other chemicals as well. But we don't test for it in this country, so we don't really know what's going on. Likewise with that monitoring I mentioned of the neonicotinoids in the soil, the government is not doing that monitoring. That was a university that did the monitoring. There is no, despite legal levels being set for the maximum allowable level, there is no monitoring being carried out. I want to turn away from pesticides now towards agroecology. It's the solution to all of these problems, and as I've said already, it is now globally recognised that we have to have a paradigm shift away from chemical dependence in agriculture to agroecology, or as we know it, organics, biodynamics and biological farming. There is widespread international agreement that this has to change. And if you're interested in reading more about that, the book down at the back, Replacing Chemicals with Biology, gives a lot of details about that. What agroecology means is working with the environment instead of continuing to control it. I just missed that slide. It means creating a healthy, balanced ecosystem that discourages pests and diseases. Primarily, it means creating a healthy living soil that gives best support to plants to resist pests and diseases. It means minimising use of chemical fertilisers and instead using compost, animal manures, and encouraging microorganisms to make nutrients available to plants. In addition, there are a raft of non-chemical options to keep pests at bay, including introduced biological controls, like the aphids being eaten there, and parasitic wasps knocking out caterpillars, pheromones, which are copies of insects' natural hormones, which disrupt insect mating, and yellow sticky traps, as we see there, which attract whitefly and a number of other insects, and solar lamps that attract guava moth into an oil trap. And there's lots and lots and lots and lots of other solutions. I can't hope to give you more than a brief taste of these tonight, because the solution depends on the crop and the pest and the context in which it's being used. The main thing to remember, though, is you need to design your system and manage your system so that pests are not attracted into it, and when they do arrive, your plants have got a chance of withstanding them. The evidence of the success is in the book I mentioned earlier, the Replacing Chemicals with Biology. I detailed examples from all over the world showing how successful it is in terms of increased crop yields, decreased farmers' costs, improved returns and lower health costs. There are only a few copies for sale at the back. If we run out, I can give you a website in which you can download it from. And finally, I'd just like to wrap up with a little brief section on what needs to happen next. And the first thing is we need a policy change away from propping up chemical-dependent agriculture and supporting organic, biodynamic and biological farming. I'm not talking about subsidies. I'm talking just about a supportive policy environment. We don't have that. We have a hostile policy environment in New Zealand and have had for a very long time for organics. And despite that, we have an annual growth rate of organics of 11% in New Zealand. We could be doing much better. Right now, the annual growth in organic sales globally is 25% and has been since 2000. We're missing out. Our farmers are missing out. We could be part of that growth. We could be making a lot of money out of that growth. But we have a government that has turned its back on it. The organic sector has been trying to get the government to regulate the term organic and regulate a national standard for a long time. We're the only OECD country that doesn't have a regulated national standard for organics, meaning that anybody can call something organic, even when it's not. And that's holding the sector back in this country. We have a $500 million sector at the moment for organics, but it could be huge in comparison with what it is now. So that's the first thing. It's not requiring any dollars, it's requiring a change in heart and a change in political will. We need a massive overhaul of our pesticide regulatory system to at least bring it into line with best practice overseas. For example, the European Union have established cut-off criteria for carcinogens, chemical pesticides that cause mutations and reproductive toxins. And then they're in the process of establishing them for endocrine disruptors. If a pesticide doesn't meet a threshold that they've set for these effects, they're just banned. We don't go about trying to figure out if the benefit to some people who are using them might be more than the risk to the rest of the community. They're just banned. The priority must be given to human health and the environment and not to profit. And in Sweden, if there is a safer alternative, then a pesticide is not registered or it is deregistered. We need to include the principle of minimum harm in our registration. The principle of minimum harm goes like this. Choose the method that causes the least harm to humans and the environment while still being sufficiently effective. Now, isn't that pretty logical? But we don't have that concept in this country. We don't have a regulatory system that pays any attention to alternatives at all. You want the chemical registered? You want to use it? Great, go ahead. That's all that we have. I mean, there's a risk assessment is undertaken, but essentially, if a chemical company wants a chemical registered, then the approach is that we will get that registered for you if it's acceptable, if the risk is acceptable, without any concern about whether there are better ways of doing things. It's not just the registration authorities that need to look at this principle. We also need to too. Don't use a fly spray, use a fly swat. Don't give these, fly sprays are pyrethroids, they're carcinogens. Don't do that to yourselves. So we need to look at our own actions. You can vote against pesticides, Nora's already said this at the beginning, you can vote against pesticides by growing your own food organically and support organics by buying organics. I did my slides. A recent report released by the European Union found that pregnant women eating food containing pesticide residues is lowering the IQ, and we've talked about this already, lowering the IQ in children, estimated to cost 125 billion euros every year in the European Union alone. Translated to New Zealand, that's a cost of $1.76 billion every year that New Zealand is paying in lost IQ in our kids. And that doesn't include cancers, Parkinson's disease, diabetes, obesity and all the other chronic diseases that I mentioned, not to mention the 76 fatalities either. That's simply lost potential from lost IQ. New Zealand cannot afford to keep eating food with pesticides in it. Thank you.